Good evening, everybody that's in attendance. There are numerous people online. Welcome to our Offshore Wind and the Sakonnet River, a dialogue for coastal communities. I am Leah Hitchin. I'm the town planner for Portsmouth, and we are here to talk about offshore wind. I would like to introduce some VIPs in the room. We have Linda Ujifuja, current town council member and just was elected to District 71, if you want to raise your hand. Sitting right next to her is Michelle McGaw, General Assembly representative. Also in the room is Kevin Aguiar, current Portsmouth Town Council President. So tonight is a question and answer kind of forum where we're going to discuss our questions with scientists, researchers in the room that are not affiliated with any current project going on in Portsmouth. And we're going to talk as it relates to the Sakonnet River. This is obviously the first meeting of a three-part series, and questions that we have tonight may roll over into the second forum. Our goal is to respond to questions and concerns as it relates to offshore wind energy and the Sakonnet River. During this meeting, we will also identify other questions and concerns that we all have, and during this time, everybody should have a card on your seat. If that card fills up, there's boards around the room. Go to the boards and write your questions down. For the first hour of the meeting, you will hear from informative presenters about the marine environment in the Sakonnet River and what we know right now about offshore wind energy and the cables needed to transport it. The presenters will try to provide the latest science that we can answer questions initially raised by the town of Portsmouth and the Rhode Island Anglers Association, which is also part of this forum tonight. The second hour of the meeting will be dedicated to the discussion with our attendees, both here and online, so experts can try to answer questions to the best of their ability. For those that might not have heard something visually, hearing-wise, this meeting is being recorded and will be available via YouTube on the Rhode Island Sea Grant channel. With that being said, I am going to turn over this microphone to Greg Vesby. And I am done with this microphone.
Thank you, Leah. Thanks very much. I think whether you have been a lifelong resident of Rhode Island or just recently arrived, it doesn't take long to realize how special the Sakonnet River is. And the more time you spend here and the more time you spend along its banks, you start to appreciate how pristine it really is still, especially compared to the other passageways that we have up into the bay. The Sakonnet really kind of remains a jewel. So anytime there's talk about something that might possibly impact the river, the Rhode Island saltwater anglers and a lot of other folks start to perk up and get interested because it's our river, so to speak. So whatever happens to it, we should know what exactly that's going to be and how that's going to impact us potentially. So I appreciate everybody coming out here tonight to learn a little more about it. And I appreciate our speakers and all the folks from Sea Grant and the town of Portsmouth for being so willing to help put this together, and hopefully one of two more parts to go of a three-part series. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn this over to Jen McCann, and I look forward to the evening.
Thanks, Greg. So it's great to see you all. Thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for those of you who are listening to us virtually. It's great to have you. So again, my name is Jen McCann, and I'm with the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center and also Rhode Island Sea Grant. And our job, many of you know that, the University of Rhode Island, we've had a lot of people come up, well, my niece or my nephew or my child was educated at URI, which is something we do at URI. We train the next generation of Rhode Islanders and other people in the country. The other thing we do at URI, we are state university, is to provide a service to the people of Rhode Island. It's our responsibility to support people of Rhode Island and help them understand what's going on and to share the science and the amazing research and technical resources that we have at URI to help you all make better decisions and more informed decisions. So that's what we're doing here today. I will say this is not a public hearing, okay? This is not a debate. This is an informational session. It's an educational session with some really amazing individuals who have come here to talk about what they're studying about issues related to the Sakonnet River and offshore wind energy. So thank you both for providing your time here to share your expertise. So again, we can make more informed decisions. As Leah mentioned very nicely, is that this is this is the first event of a 3-part series. So again, there's a commitment here to answer questions that you may have related to offshore wind energy and as it relates to the Sakonnet River. So you'll see that there's some easels out here, and what we want to know is, what do you want to know about? What are your questions? Okay, so Abby Green, who is around here, right here, Abby's been great in helping to organize this event, has put out these stickies right here, and you can have as many as you want, all right? But see, what you want to do is write down, this is the topic that I want to learn about. This is what I want to know, okay? And just, either during the event or afterwards, just put it on one of these easels, and that will help us to shape, again, the next 2 sessions, okay? So right now we're just going to go right to the presenters. What we're going to be doing is we're going to hear from two experts, and then we're going to bring in 2 of our stakeholders to help give them a chance to ask some specific questions to our experts. And then, so there'll be sort of a discussion between the 4 of them. And then we're going to open it up, as Leah mentioned, to all of you. Think about your questions, and also apparently we need to speak in to the microphone. So we do have some microphones that will encourage you to speak into. So I'm going to introduce both panelists right now. So Dr. Conor McManus, he's the chief of Rhode Island's Department of Environmental Management's Division of Marine Fisheries. And Conor's been around here for a while, and much of his research has focused on how marine fish, invertebrates, and their habitats of the northeast U.S. continental shelf have responded to changes in climate, harvest, ecosystem dynamics, anthropogenic stressors through time, okay? And Conor has, as we call him, we don't call him Dr. McManus, he sits on the New England Fisheries Management Council, Science and Statistical Committee. He's an adjunct professor at URI, and also at the University of Massachusetts. So we're really, thank you, Conor, for coming tonight. And then we have another amazing individual, Kevin Stokesbury, Dr. Kevin Stokesbury, and he's a Commonwealth professor, I have no idea what that means, in the Department of Fisheries, Oceanography, the School of Marine Science and Technology at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Kevin, your research examines the marine ecology of invertebrates and fish, their spatial distribution, population dynamics, and the impacts of fishing and energy development. Okay, so this is what he does every day. And when I was looking at his, he has a funny accent because he is from Canada, I will say, and he has, that's not on your bio, but, and also he serves on several international committees and national committees, very impressive on this type of stuff, okay? So they don't know all the answers. We're going to tell you right up front, okay? But they're going to try, they're going to give you their science-based information. And again, if you stump them, then write down your question and put it up there and we'll try to find the answer for you, okay? So Conor, I'm going to give this to you.
Thanks, Jen. So again, my name is Conor McManus. I'm with Rhode Island DEM Marine Fisheries. And my goal today is to kind of give you a whirlwind of what we do for fisheries monitoring within Rhode Island, particularly in the Sakonnet River, and help try and tee up and queue up some research questions and thoughts for what we don't know about the system that warrant further research consideration as we move forward with further discussions through this event series. So just by way of background, who we are, Rhode Island DEM Marine Fisheries in Jamestown. Our real goal is trying to manage leading really the science and management for marine fisheries in Rhode Island, which is typically from the coast to 3 nautical miles. And as part of this, we're looking to conduct science to inform sound management decisions and build outreach and education programs that convey that science and management decisions to the public. Now, I'm going to overwhelm you with a lot of words. Don't worry about the words, but my point here is to show you that effectively, a big part of what we do is long-term monitoring for a lot of marine species, using all different types of surveys, sampling fish, crustaceans, adult fish, juvenile fish, all types of animals, with the goal of this work trying to basically understand how populations change over time and better understand what might be driving those changes in the populations. So today, I highlight these surveys because I'll be pulling some of these out to showing you what we've learned about the system within Rhode Island with different species as well as, or specifically the Sakonnet River. So the first kind of database and survey I wanted to discuss with you all is a coastal trawl survey that we run in Rhode Island, which samples throughout Narragansett Bay through seasonal surveying as well as within the Sakonnet River, both seasonally and every month at fixed stations. And the goal of this survey is to understand how young fish as well as adult fish and invertebrates change in abundance and distribution throughout these areas. And the data is incredibly helpful for us in trying to understand changes in time. This figure here for relative black sea bass catch from our survey over time in the spring is one example of how this data is really useful, where we go back and sample. We've been sampling since the 70s, and as we move forward, we're able to understand when these changes occur and start to understand why. In this example here, as many of you who recreationally fish or commercially fish have obviously noted the big increase in black sea bass we saw in the early 2010s. So this is the utility of these types of data sets in terms of understanding these questions. When we think about the Sakonnet River, a lot of the species that we see in this system are both of commercial and recreational significance as well as ecosystem considerations important. So when we think about black sea bass, tautog, squid, bay anchovy. These are all species that are really common catch within this portion of our survey in the Sakonnet River. Without this information, we don't have an understanding of what's there as well as how it changes over time. So this is one of the tools we use to understand, new, soon-to-be recruited individuals or juveniles into the adult population as well as the adults. But what this doesn't really help us understanding is the trends in young fish or really, really small fish, which is used to try and help forecast what the population will look like in the future. So to really get an understanding of what the populations for these stocks or species are at these really tiny stages, to understand if we're actually seeing the babies reside in these areas, we use other tools like seine surveys, where we sample from May through October throughout Rhode Island state waters with some sites here in the Sakonnet River to get an understanding of interannual changes in various species like tautog. And again, these time series really allow us to understand when we might see increases or decreases, in this case for tautog, increases in tautog over time, and then allow us to maybe anticipate what we might see for the adult populations later on. within the Sakonnet River specifically, we see a number of different species, of course, through time, but some of the major ones that we typically see, Atlantic silversides, tautog, mummy chug, these are smaller fish that are really important for the ecosystem function as bait fish for a lot of species. But then we see some pretty more, I guess, abnormal or irregular species as well from these surveys that we wouldn't see on a day-to-day basis. One of those being this group of tropical fish, whether it's four-spot butterfly fish or other things that are coming into the system at different times of the year, whether it's the Gulf Stream moving in or whether warmer waters are occurring in the system. So the surveys, again, through time allow for us to understand as well the introduction of these new species to the system that maybe day-to-day we don't see when we're fishing or when we're at the beach, but are actually in the system as well. So these are just a number of the species that we capture that maybe not in the trawl survey, but at an earlier part in their life cycle via a seine survey. And the seine survey and the trawl surveys are really useful tools when thinking about informing stock assessments and how abundances are changing over time. But they're not always useful for pelagic fish or small bait fish that are in the water column and migrate up and down the coast. We often have to use other more novel techniques to try and understand those, such as with menhaden, where we'll use a spotter pilot survey and having helicopters go out and try and estimate schools of fish within state waters of Rhode Island throughout the year. And this is another tool we use to try and estimate biomass, not just within Rhode Island as a whole, but we'll actually get spatially discrete estimates of abundances for menhaden through this method. The goal here for us is to try and understand how this species, which is of significant ecosystem importance as well as supporting commercial fisheries, is changing through time and within season, and we ultimately use this data not just to understand the seasonal and interannual trends, but then also inform the commercial fisheries management within Rhode Island. And what we see in the Sakonnet River over time is that while it's not always highly abundant for this species in the river, there are some major significant years where menhaden flood into the Sakonnet River, and the area is of significance to them, either in the spring or in the fall, with the example of 2021, which was a moderately high year, and we saw high biomass of menhaden moving back south in the fall and residing in the Sakonnet River, contributing to what I guess would call a banner year for the Sakonnet River in this time series. So I'll switch a little bit now from finfish to shellfish and crustaceans here, going to one of Rhode Island's culturally and economically and recreationally significant species, quahog, or the hard clam. And this is a species that supports a significant commercial fishery throughout Rhode Island and many people recreation for. And we monitor this species using a dredge survey as opposed to the trawl or the seine surveys, given that they don't move other than when they're eggs and larvae in the water. So they sit in the mud, and we'll use a dredge to monitor their abundance, and with the same ultimate goal of trying to understand their population trajectories over time and how the stock has changed. And so what we'll do is we'll sample each of these little boxes either every year or every other year as part of the sampling design to understand the status of the resource. What we see in Rhode Island is, just to orient folks, red and yellows are high abundance, blue is lower abundance. And what we see typically is these areas in the upper bay are typically of higher abundance, with the Sakonnet not being zero, but of lower abundance. This is often the result of areas being historically closed to harvest or areas that are closed due to water quality conditions. And while the abundance, for example, is lower in the Sakonnet River than the Providence River, we definitely see quahogs here that do support commercial fisheries and recreational harvest. And the data itself can allow us to understand how this portion of quahogs in Rhode Island have changed over time. So we certainly see quahogs within the northern part of the Sakonnet River as well. So I'll switch to lobsters now. This is another unique species where traditionally trawl gears and things of that nature are not adequate or very efficient in understanding their populations because they can't access the hard structure that lobsters reside in due to hangs and such, which has led to the development of more novel or new techniques for monitoring them in a scientific fashion. In this case being a lobster ventless trap survey, which Rhode Island, along with colleagues in Maine, Mass, and New Hampshire, run at the same time and consistently to try and give us an understanding of how juvenile lobster populations are changing in the Northeast. So to orient you here, every year from June through August, we will sample stations randomly within this Rhode Island portion here, with the lighter colors being of shallower waters and the lighter colors being deeper waters. And this really is informative to trying to understand the juvenile population of lobsters. So by looking at the juveniles, again, we get a little bit of an understanding of what we might see for the adult population in 2-3 years later. And this survey is really good at capturing, again, juvenile lobsters about this size here, but it also intercepts a lot of other species from black sea bass, scup, tautog, whelk, conger eel, some species that we may not necessarily see always in our other surveys. So by assessing a different habitat with different goals, we're actually able to learn a lot more about the system than what we have from our other surveys. What we see in the Sakonnet River typically, and this is looking at all of our data averaged over time, for samples or for stations that we've sampled outside the river, as well as just at the southern tip of the river based on our stratification, we actually see that this area is a bit higher in abundance than what we would see, particularly in the mid and upper Narragansett Bay and even down to the west along the coastal Rhode Island. So we actually see pretty good catch rates of juvenile lobsters within this area at the Sakonnet River. And while not plotted here, typically we'll also see that where lobster catch may be greater here, and some of the other stations north where it's lower, we'll also see higher whelk catch. Not in great numbers, but just where we'll see whelk more caught in this system is in this portion as opposed to out front. So as we all know, fish move too, and when they're coming through changes with time. So one of the techniques that we also look to try and understand their movement is by using what we call acoustic telemetry, where we use these water bottle looking things and we place them throughout Rhode Island state waters and these dots here. And as fish that are tagged either by us or collaborators in the Northwest Atlantic with things that look like this, an acoustic tag, we are able to actually have those tags ping as they move by each of these buoys. So by leaving them out there, we get an understanding of not just what species may be in an area, but when they come and when they go, and how long do they reside in a certain area. And so just for context, a lot of coastal Rhode Island we sample. There's actually additional stations we have that aren't listed here, but for the points of the talk today, we have stationed some within the Sakonnet River to get an understanding of fish movement in and out of the river. So do we see fish coming in, passing through, up to Mount Bay, and then coming back south with the goal of trying to gate this, somewhat gate the system here as fish may be moving in and out. Within the Rhode Island receiver array, we've seen all different types of species, not necessarily tagged by us, but by other collaborators along the coast, from various shark species, tuna, flounders, lots and lots of striped bass. And so it's been a really helpful tool for us to understand how species that we may not see in the trawl survey or the spotter pilot survey or eventless trap survey are using Rhode Island coastal waters, which has been really helpful. We began this work in 2019, and again, in this example for striped bass, while we have not tagged any striped bass in Rhode Island as part of this, we've seen lots and lots of striped bass tagged from Massachusetts and Maine and Delaware and Maryland and Virginia and New York moving through this area. So it's been a really helpful tool for us, even without the tagging of ourselves. When we look at striped bass in this example, at this point, we do see striped bass moving through. We have not, at this point, seen some of these other species move through, but knowing that they do reside in these waters, the species that have been tagged have not utilized it, but we have seen that striped bass do come through the Sakonnet River, which of course many of us would agree with recreationally angling, but we do actually not only have presence absence, but the timing of when they come through, certain dates, and we can start to look at, was it warm at that time, was it cool at that time, was there plenty of bait at that time, to try and understand when and why they're using the Sakonnet River. And so as we continue this work, we'll get a better database of an understanding of what's actually here for movement ecology, but right now, the detections that we've received from these receivers are primarily tied to striped bass in the Sakonnet River. I wanted to talk about larval fish as well, because when we think about the fish that I've spoken about today thus far, whether that be adults, juveniles, fish in their first year of life, there's a whole portion of a lot of these species' life that's smaller than my thumbnail, and they're either drifting in the ocean or they're eggs floating, which really is helpful data in trying to understand oftentimes where fish and invertebrates spawn, but also the connectivity of perhaps larvae being moved from one distant place to another, and understanding how an animal completes its first year of life. Over time, not continuously, we've had the opportunity to monitor larval fish and invertebrates within Rhode Island through a number of different programs. One highlighted here via the blue different numbers are stations from ichthyoplankton or larval fish monitoring, tied to primarily looking at winter and spring larval communities. We did this through 2001 to 2008 and then 2016 to 17. And so we've done these kind of spatially time discrete sampling, as well as we have long-term monitoring from Mount Hope Bay that's allowed us to understand back to the 70s how some of these communities have changed over time. So the ability to leverage these different data sets and understand the system. With our surveys for the broader Narragansett Bay, we've also tried to align them with the same survey locations to get a better understanding how larvae in a given area correspond then to the ones that will settle out to the bottom column, the bottom of the water column later that year. And this data is really helpful for guiding us on how Rhode Island species are changing over time, as well as specifically in the Sakonnet River, where in Mount Hope Bay, the data set's really highlighted how larval winter flounder has changed over time. And then in this kind of time block within Rhode Island, we see that in the 2001 to 2008 period, winter flounder in the Sakonnet River was one of the highest areas of abundance for the species from our surveys and sampling. And we've obviously, from the picture, seen a marked decline since then, even over a decade, about eightfold. But we do see that the Sakonnet River, relative to other areas within Narragansett Bay, is supporting winter flounder larvae, again, albeit low, but more than other areas often. So this data has been really helpful for us in answering questions at a spatial scales like that. It's also been helpful when looking at other species important to Rhode Island, like Atlantic cod. And for those not familiar with Atlantic cod science and management of recent, with warming waters, oftentimes folks have kind of counted cod out as waters have warmed, and that's not necessarily their preference, although what we're finding still in even recent years is maybe they're climate deniers, as they are still hanging around in parts of Rhode Island and supporting significant recreational fisheries. And so what we've seen here, I'll orient you in this figure a bit, is that by coupling all these data sets together, looking at larvae, in the top right here, we get a sense of where the larval cod are that we see in Rhode Island. And they're making it all the way up to northern reaches of Narragansett Bay, Mount Hope Bay, some in the Sakonnet River, but even upper Narragansett Bay. What we see then looking at our trawl surveys is that we also then see the younger year throughout state waters. And these are fish in their first year of life, so recently settled but not 1 year old yet. And as they get 1, 2, 3 year olds, they get older and they start to leave Narragansett Bay. So what we've been able to tease together by these spatial data sets is not only do we see cod, but that Narragansett Bay, Sakonnet River, Mount Hope Bay appear to be a significant, or able to support cod in the first year of its life, and thus be perhaps a nursery for the species, and making it considerable essential fish habitat for Atlantic cod. So by looking at these data sets, not only do we get a sense of what's going on in specific areas like the Sakonnet River, but how the bay itself may serve as a nursery for the species. I'm going to go quick through a couple of these, but I wanted to talk about commercial and recreational fisheries because while we monitor the best of our abilities, we also know a lot of users are in the systems of the Sakonnet River, harvesting at various scales and seeing things that we don't see every day and are not necessarily capturing. And so we don't have tremendous spatial data on commercial harvest in Rhode Island, but we do have some that speaks to some of the shellfish fisheries, particularly quahog and whelk, which are pictured here. This is just 2021 landings per year spatially. And for quahog, we see that the Sakonnet River doesn't support the predominant source of the catch, but we do see that for whelk, the Sakonnet River is important. And not only that, while we don't have spatial data on everything, for every fishery, we know that there's significant trawling, fish pots, lobster potting, the floating fish traps at the mouth of Sakonnet that are active businesses that see a variety of species that we don't necessarily see. And I'll quickly just note, similarly for recreational fisheries, we interview anglers and see a whole wide list of species within this system. Some of them common, tautog, scup, black sea bass, summer flounder, but some that you may not necessarily think about. Oyster toadfish, northern kingfish, little tunny. These are species that may not be the first thing you think of, but they're in the system, either contributing to the ecosystem dynamics or supporting other ecosystem functions. So I just wanted to close really quick by giving with this information, kind of a whirlwind tour of what we do and monitoring some research ideas and recommendations in the context of what we thought about today. So when we think about changes to the benthos or the deep water from a potential change of infrastructure, when we think about that, we can think about it in two contexts. How does the ecosystem change from habitat, and then those that rely on the habitat? So for a habitat change, will we see differences in sediment? Will we have suspended particles in the water from that work? Or what happens with moving boulders out of the way that may be providing habitat? And then obviously, how do species respond to that, particularly demersal species that rely on structure, or like tautog, or other species that rely on the bottom all the time, like different flatfish, as well as the inverse that don't move all that far, like quahogs and whelk, and the things that live in the sediment, like worms, that are eaten by everything. EMF is another one where different species respond differently, and they respond differently depending on how old they are. So there's all these different types of questions as how each of those will respond to a prospective EMF field. And then lastly, just ending on the fact that we have monitoring programs, but there's a lot of things we're missing, admittedly. Sakonnet River it was believed that it hosted a lot of sturgeon as a migratory path up to Mount Hope Bay. We see marine mammals, but we don't monitor marine mammals over there regularly. And then there's all the different life stages of these species that I mentioned today that aren't always holistically captured in our work. So with that, I just want to give a quick acknowledgement to the program and all the people who work hard to maintain these data sets. And I'm sure I'm out of time, but if you have any questions, you can email me and check out our website. Thanks very much.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Stokesbury. I'm a professor at UMass Dartmouth at SMass, and Conor's a hard act to follow there. He's not only a great scientist, but a very enthusiastic one, and so I appreciate all the work you're doing. It was a great explanation of the species there. I was asked to, you see on the agenda, there's a few questions that people laid out, and so I'm going to try and just at least start to focus a little bit on those questions for my presentation. So I came here in September of '98, and a lot of my work is has been with the scallop industry, looking at drop camera assessment of the continental shelf, and particularly the scallop resource. So I'll explain a little bit about that as I go. But before we jump in, I want to talk about this. This is a member of vagrants theory, and I teach this to all my students. And Mike Sinclair was a huge influence on me. And it is, when you think about marine species, there's a huge question in our knowledge between how much of the stock do you need to create the next generation. It's called the stock recruitment relationship. And there's a few theories out there. One of them is the match-mismatch, where they think that it has to coordinate with plankton blooms and larval survival. This one, which Mike Sinclair wrote in kind of as a different approach is one that's really influenced my work. And basically what it says is that animals need to be in a specific spot at a specific time for sexual reproduction. And their life cycle is a way of achieving that. So the dark line here, if an animal's on that trajectory through the physical environment and gets here at the right place at the right time, they'll reproduce. If not, they'll become vagrants. And sometimes that'll create a founding population, but more often than not, that's lost. And it's one of the reasons why so many of the fishery species that we work on are selected, which means they produce a huge amount of offspring and only a very few survive. So keep that in the back of your mind. A lot of the species Conor was talking about have that life strategy. And when we talk about the kind of environmental change that's about to happen, we want to keep that focused. So to start off, wind power has been around for a while. Wind fields have been developing a while, and this is from the the global offshore report on wind here, and you can see that in Europe they've really they've had some develop and some actually pass through. They're on a growth rate of about 22%, and they are developing their nearshore environments. They've already done some different analysis on what kind of effect it has on the fishery. But that growth rate, it's constant, fairly constant, 20%. It's an upward slope. But when you compare that to what we're doing here in North America, we are really going at it full bore in the next few years. So this is from 2020 to 2030. And that's almost an 80% growth rate. And the next couple of years, we could very well see it. So the amount of money and interest that has been going on this has just been incredible. For example, these recent areas that were auctioned off of New York last January went for $4.3 billion, so a huge amount of funds. And then the Department of Energy has just come out with a report talking about how many jobs, how much money and how much carbon these are going to, jobs are going to create, money is going to cost, and carbon is going to remove. So that is a good report if you want to take a look at some of the projections. And if you look up and down the coast, I think on this chart there's about 33 different companies that are interested in it. There's also starting to be some development on the West Coast. So a lot of different companies, a lot of interest, but at the same time, there's also a very productive fishery. The fishery for the United States is almost $5 billion. That was in 2019. 40% of it is landed here on our East Coast. Scallops and lobsters, hugely important. Also, it's very important recreationally. 60% of the recreational catch is along our eastern seaboard here. So these are both very important, and how these different industries and interests are going to mix is a question that we don't really know the answer to. And I don't know that we really know I don't know that we have a scientific framework in place to address it. So before we kind of focus down on the river, I and my colleagues tried to put this together, this type of cube, where you look at the pillars of sustainability is ecological, economic, social, and institutional. And then you look at it on different scales. You can relate it to the individual, the population, or the community, but you can also put it on a spatial scale. And each one of these cubes is filled up with, I suggested for the fisheries that we use the Magnuson-Stevenson Act, because it's already done for our managed fisheries, and we kind of put the wind farms on the same type of metric. It is published, and you're welcome. It's available free if you want to read it. But the point that for this particular presentation I wanted to talk about was the spatial scale. So there's spatial and temporal scales, scales you look on this. So whether you're looking at the scale of centimeter to kilometer, kilometer to thousands of kilometer, or beyond, and the temporal scale, the pre-construction, construction usually takes a couple of years, operation 20 to 40, and then decommission. So So to keep those in mind as we go along here. Now, to give you a little bit of a background on me, as Jen mentioned, I'm from Nova Scotia. Although my dad was from the States here, so I do jump both sides of the fence. And I did my master's at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, up in the Upper Bay of Fundy. And at that time, during the last energy crises back in the 80s, there was a lot of focus, and there still is a lot of focus on tidal power. So they built an experimental turbine here in the Annapolis River. Basically, at that time, the technology required a barrage. The head pond fills up, and then they close it, and it reduces. And so that was my introduction into a lot of environmental assessment. We did the same kind of seining that Conor was just talking about, looked at the alewives going down through it as well as the other fish to see what type of mortality these fish suffered by passing through this and what its effect would be on the population. Then, after doing my PhD on scallops, which led to the drop camera work, the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, and I went to Alaska and worked with the herring fishery up there on the effects of the oil spill on the Pacific herring populations in Prince William Sound. And that, again, was a environmental impact study. Now, both those studies, both the turbine and the Exxon Valdez oil spill, were what we called control impact studies, in that the impact had already happened. Like the oil spill happened, and then people wanted to know, well, what was the effect? Did it hurt the fishery or not? With the wind farm development and with your cable laying and stuff, you have the advantage of having it coming down the pipe, so you can get ahead of it. And that's really important in this. The best environmental study is the before-after control impact, or some variation of that. But the key point is that you find two areas that are similar, that are influenced by the same environment, the same weather conditions, have hopefully similar species structures, and you sample them at a high enough statistical frequency so that you can figure out what kind of shift you want. For example, and I'll get to it in a second, but some of the impact analysis we're doing with Vineyard Wind, we set 25% better on the shift. So you want to be able to statistically see if there's a 25% change. So you sample it before, then your impact occurs, and then you sample it for a certain amount of times after. And that allows you to go from the speculative to actually, hopefully, testing it statistically and saying we are this certain with this much accuracy and this much precision that there has been an effect. Now, some people have advocated for, and I think the federal government is also saying with the wind farms, that you use these bag designs, which is a before-after gradient. It's an adaptation of the Backy, and I think that for your situation in Sakonnet, both these would work quite well, and we could talk about it with a discussion. But especially where the cable is going to come up through the river, having the basic idea of this is that you have a gradient. So if you were doing series of transects, for example, across the river, and then you see how that number of species or the abundance of species changes, you do have, I think it's quite a good opportunity for that gradient, as well as the before-after control impact. And what the reason for that would be is if you lay the cable, you have been fishing striped bass in here, all of a sudden your striped bass drops off, but up in the Westport River it hasn't dropped off at all. If you're studying those in the right way, you can say, well, that's a good example that it's a good possibility that the cable was the effect of that. So. And that's the structure that we kind of use for the mentor or the monitoring plans that my colleague Dr. Cadron and I put together to look at, and the type of surveys for the Vineyard Wind. So we are working with Vineyard Wind to try and assess their area, and of course they haven't developed it yet, but we've been doing the baseline work where we've done two. We're coming up on the third year. Doing the ventless, we do several. We do otter trawl. Dr. Pingo, he and his lab do the otter trawl. We're doing a ventless trap survey, and then the drop camera survey. And one of the things that we tried to do was keep these surveys with the same structure and design as the states are doing. As Conor just explained, they have a ventless trap survey. Well, ours is using the same protocol so that we can not only compare what's going on in the impact area and the area adjacent, but also what's happening in the near coast with the different state surveys. And so far, it's been great because we've, with my first student who went through this, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maine all supplied their data so that they could see how those changes are. So you're, again, trying to keep that idea of scale and looking at the different impacts. This is the type of drop camera work we're doing and the kind of information you get from it. And this type of survey, I think, is really important because it gives you an absolute measure. It lets you know the number of animals per meter squared within these quadrats. And with the kind of cameras now and high resolution, you can really get at it. So for the offshore, where you're looking at the turbine and the turbine structure, you're really looking at the kind of colonization that's going to go on those pillars, how it's going to affect the substrat, how it's going to affect the water column. Then there's also the acoustic and the electromagnetic environments. And this was a recent paper that kind of looked at, for example, how much colonization there was in the world's ports and what kind of effect that has on the invertebrate community. A recent paper in this physical oceanography journal, the Oceanographic Journal, where they look at the colonizations from some colleagues over in Europe and also here with Drew Carey with Inspire. But they look at the successional development of, after 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5, and so on, what kind of growth. Although I got to say that I don't entirely agree with the climax community. I don't know, I think that might be a bit of a myth and that there's always a change through. But anyway, remember, some people look at this and say, this is wonderful. It's great stuff. It creates a reef, more fish. What's not to like? On the other hand, remember that continental shelf is a homogeneous sand, mud substrat, and similar to what the Great Plains must have been like. These animals that live there now have evolved to live in that way with what I was talking about with the member of vagrants theory. And so you may be changing their environment. So you might get a different environment, and maybe for you that's better because it's the fish you want, but for someone else or for the animal, it's not. So Jennifer asked me to talk a little bit about and I have to say that I don't know very much about the cable laying, but a colleague of mine, Jeff Coles, who you might consider in one of these other ones, Jeff's a fluid dynamic modeler and engineer, and he crosses the bridge between the modeling and the physical oceanography and the fisheries scientists, and kind of can talk both languages. So he's absolutely invaluable to us. And these are a couple of slides that he gave. We're teaching a class on fisheries wind farms. So for the cable laying, these next two slides are his, and he really presented these two types of technology. And this is one where you lay, and I do not know which one the Mayflower may be considering, but one is kind of similar to the clam dredge that Conor was talking about, where you're using hydraulic pressure, you're running it through, you're laying the cable behind it, and then the cable cover, it gets buried. And so you have, this works well on soft sediment. It moves right along, I guess. But in this picture, of course, which is a dramatization of it, it doesn't look like it's disturbing anything, but perhaps it will. And then the other one is more like a plow, and this is, I guess, for the harder substrat, where you plow through. You can see this gentleman standing here, so you can see the size of it. It's quite large, and that kind of lays a trench up through it, and is pulled along. So those are the two. I would imagine that they're probably going to be using one of the two. And so you're probably going to want to try and measure the type of physical impact that might come by, and the amount of sediment, plume, and stuff. That will depend on your currents within the river. Also, that'll signify how much they get moved or or how often they become unburied. And if you have hard substrate, if you have hard rock, then they'll lay over some kind of concrete mat or some kind of structure on top of that to hold that cable in place. We've done a little bit of nearshore work for this the same type of environmental before-after control impact with the tidal power turbine that was going to be set up in the Cape Cod Canal. And so here you see a younger Dave Bethany out with us dropping a camera down. This stuff, it doesn't have to be expensive or complicated. This is a few underwater cameras and some GoPros, and you get you get these lovely pictures. So I wanted to show you this to show that you don't have to wait around for huge amounts of money or huge amounts of input. This is fairly simple stuff, which is why I do it, and you can get some lovely information. And especially, you come out here with this, a fish plotter, a depth sounder, and a GoPro, and you can tell the distribution of the substrate. You can tell where the mussel beds are, where the sponges are. You can get a lot of information just from this stuff, and that table's a little example of some of it. There was also a question about the electromagnetic field, and I again don't know so much about it, although it's something I'm quite interested in. And I get, from what I read, and this is from the Boehm site, the electromagnetic field is pretty much sheathed within the cable, but the electric field is shielded within the cable, but the magnetic field is not. And it does make a difference. I guess it reduces it. If you bury it by 6 feet, it's about a four-fold reduction in it. But what, if you look online, there's a lot of studies about different magnetic fields, and are they, do they attract fish? Do they repel fish? Are they cancerous? What's the effect? For me, the interesting part is the electronic field, and it depends on how much current is flowing through your cable. That's what creates the magnetic field around it. So as the electrical field increases or decreases with the flow of power, that will change the power of your magnetic field. And the question is it enough to overcome the magnetic field of the Earth? And the reason that I'm interested in that is back when I was working on that tidal power work, originally the plan was in Nova Scotia to build a tidal power barrage across here, which is about a 5-mile divide across Cape Split, and it would be the equivalent of about 40 nuclear power plants. And to do that, we started doing this environmental work, and we tagged my supervisor, Mike Dadswell, working with some of the local fishermen. We tagged shad, and we tagged about 13,000 shad up in the Cobequid and Minas Basins up in here. And we got tag returns, so we were tagging in the summer, and we got tag returns from every river from Florida all the way up to Labrador. So what that means is that those fish, and Gaspereau and river herring, alewives, they do the same thing, and the striped bass and such, they follow them. All those fish were spawning in these rivers and then migrating up the coast in the spring, feeding in this bay in the summer where these huge tides, 40-foot tides in the mudflat, and then migrating back to their rivers in the fall. So how are they doing that? How are they knowing to travel along the continental shelf? Well, one theory is that it's using the Earth's magnetic field based on their lateral lines, and if that's the case, then these offshore wind farms and the different cables could have an effect as they'll be running across the continental shelf. They're also running up into the rivers like the Sakonnet that we're talking about, and it may not be that it kills the fish. Maybe it just bothers them. Maybe it just slows them down. But this is all set up in a specific timing to make sure that they're back at the right place at the right time to reproduce. And if they can't, and they've already been evolving to adapt to that, and if that changes, that will affect things. So I hope with that, and I hope that wasn't too all over the place, but That's what I got. That's where I'm at with the thinking now with it. Thank you.
Great. So now we're going to put the chairs. You guys want to come up?
Here, Jen.
Okay, thank you. And we have another microphone, is that right? Do we have another? Yeah. Great. So how many of you have already written a question that you want to put up on one of these flips? Can you raise your hand if you have? Okay, good. Anybody over here? Perfect, great. So again, think of your questions. We want to help answer them. So thank you, Conor, and thank you, Kevin. That was really informative and really interesting. And we, as you know, we were the ones we have partnered with. And why don't you come on up here, Greg? So we partnered tonight with, again, the town of Portsmouth, as well as with the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association. And so what we'd like to do first is have them have sort of the first shot as far as answering some questions. So don't worry, Leah, I'm not going to ask you a question. But we do have Dave Bethany, who is actually the executive director for the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation. And but most important, Dr. Dave Bethany, who works on fisheries and whatnot, he's a Portsmouth resident. Okay, so thanks, Dave, for coming. And then we have two members of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association. We have Greg Vespi, who's going to help me facilitate this conversation and the Q&A. And Greg is the executive director for RISA, the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association, and also Rich Hittinger, who is the I always say your name right, Hitting, right? Did I say it right? Okay, who's the first vice president of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers Association. So I think we have two mics, okay, that we're going to pass around, and it's basically going to be a conversation amongst us. So I'm going to give the mic to Rich to ask the first question.
Sure. Well, the question to me is, are we running the process in the correct format? And when I say that, my question is, the developers are investing a large amount of money to consider and design a cable corridor long before the environmental impact statement. And so they invest 30% design in things like directional drilling and all of the cable installation in the Sakonnet, and that I'm sure it adds up to millions of dollars. So should we have a process that we look at the environmental impacts earlier in that process? I'll ask that to Conor.
Thanks, Rich. I guess what comes to mind immediately is, like, do we have the appropriate baseline information at this time to understand and perceive impacts from any type of anthropogenic or human disturbance or activity? You know, the surveys that I mentioned today were, you know, snapshots of not just what we do, but of the ecosystem, of what's going on. We're looking at a few fixed sites interannually, and as I hopefully conveyed well, we've learned a lot about the system, but we don't know everything. And when we're talking about the impacts at fine scales, that really requires dedicated work to understanding not just what's occurring and what might occur, but then also really identifying key elements of the system that are important to understand. So I guess as it relates to your question, I think with all this, the key component is understanding what's there, and then ideally being able to use that information to guide future actions.
Yeah, I can add to that, or questioning. So Kevin, you mentioned that these before-after control impact studies are the way to do things, and a lot of times, like with Exxon Valdez oil spills, there was no before. So can the work that Rhode Island DEM is already doing to monitor the fisheries, can that be leveraged to look at it as a before for the potential impact of this cable route, or is it two different types of monitoring that are needed?
Thank you. I would say that what you could, and you know, Conor knows the structure of his sampling design, but those designs that you said, some of them go back to the 70s. So they were designed, you know, for stock assessment or you know, larger environmental assessment. What you can use those for is to get the means and the variance associated with your sampling, to then do a power analysis and tell how much sampling you might need to do. So you're not just shooting at it blind. You can say, okay, you need to decide on what scale you want to look at as far as for the impact, or if you want to look on a number of different scales. You want to make sure that when you go out and you do start sampling, you're sampling at a high enough resolution that you can tell if there's a difference or not. If you do. And that's you know, the danger of what you're saying there is that they might say, oh, that's enough, but then you find out later, well, it wasn't really enough to tell. So it's a good start, and it's for a broad scale. It's a good overview, but you probably need to use it to direct your more precise sampling.
Are you thinking of doing, I mean, as DEM, are you, sorry, it was my rule to, as DEM, are you putting those monitoring systems in place?
There's some that we are for different offshore wind studies, as well as other collaborators of ours are working on within the region to understand both some of this baseline backy design that Kevin spoke to for certain elements, but then also even looking at the Block Island Wind Farm as an example and trying to understand in a scenario where it's already there, can we learn other aspects about the turbines from that using other types of research designs and experiments. I guess in general too, a lot of what makes meetings like this so important is trying to understand also the social considerations of the system and helping prioritize. One of the challenges is that there's so many things that we could answer as scientists about the system and trying to see how it responds. Ultimately, a lot of this requires prioritization and understanding what culturally, recreationally, economically, and from an ecosystem perspective is really important for not just the system, but then also for society. And so, you know, a lot of our guidance in the past for trying to prioritize certain things has either been from larger research recommendations from management bodies or with stakeholders, you know, whether that's through advisory boards for various offshore wind plans or other types of activities to help guide some of the priority setting. So to answer your question, Shirley, for some instances, yes, we're on it, but another instance, but for this system, we're not at that stage and still trying to understand what are the priorities.
Can the panel speak a little bit to EMF and how fish sense it in terms of their sensitivity? Fairly often we hear comments about, well, you wouldn't notice it if you walked by a microwave, and you know, but obviously fish sense things differently than people do. So if the panel could speak on that a little bit, and then a second part with that, as you kind of mentioned, some fish actually, perhaps at different stages, are attracted to EMF, and some fish are repelled. Can you get a little bit based on the species that live in the Sakonnet?
So I'll do the second one, and I'll give you the first one. But I guess, yes, so there has been limited studies on trying to understand EMF impacts for species that inhabit our area, like lobsters and little skate. And the research, you know, varies. You know, I think with little skates, some of what has been found is that EMF does not cause necessarily mortality, but it can change swimming behavior. You know, how does a skate turn or swim near a cable? How fast it might swim, and then for lobsters, the my understanding is that some of the EMF impacts are inconclusive or no significant difference at this point. But again, a lot of these are either laboratory studies or what we call mesocosm studies. So applying those to the real world is another element where you have changing currents and you have changing conductivity with EMF in the salt water. So some of those are a little bit apples and oranges, but generally speaking, species will vary. Some will be attracted, some will be repelled, and then whether EMF may impact things like larval orientation and swimming behavior at an early stage. For many of the species that inhabit our waters, that's an unknown, as I understand it.
And you're going to have to articulate the first part of the question.
So I think the first part was how fish perceive EMF, because it's got to be different than humans, because we don't, it has to be pretty strong, but yet clearly fish seem to perceive it in a different fashion.
Yeah, I think there's so I'm not a particular expert on it, well, not an expert at all on this, but there are different, for example, with sharks, they have a different series of sensors in their nose that they use, and they pick up on, I think, electromagnetic frequencies when fish are in distress. The lateral line is believed to be one of the real sensitive organs that's used for the magnetic field. But there does seem to be some evidence that they actually are aware of the magnetic field of the Earth and use it. Two experiments that I've heard of at scientific meetings. One was on where they looked at whether salmon swim to the north or to the south of Vancouver Island. Because if they go to the north, the Canadians catch them and have to pay a tariff to the U.S. and vice versa. And so they have a very good record of which way these salmon swim when they're returning to the Fraser River. And they looked at where the Earth rotates, and there's a little bit of a wobble in it. And depending on which degree the Earth was wobbling when those fish were laid, when the eggs were laid in the river, that determined which side of whether they swam to the north or to the south. And the other experiment I heard on was on turtles, where I kind of like to do this actually because, well, I won't comment on it. Now everyone's gonna think I'm a creep. Yeah. Well, it's because they took little turtles and they put them in a tank, and they had a pivotal thing with a kind of like a fishing rod with a piece of a fishing line that they glued on the back, and then around it they built a magnetic frame, and they mimicked what they thought the magnetic field was around the ocean to see how these turtles migrate around the ocean, and they'd find that the turtles would orientate. It kind of sounds like putting a fly on a hair and let it spin. And so, but they'd find which way the turtles orientated based on the magnetic field. So I thought that was very cool. It would be really neat to do some of those experiments. And then, the question is how much. I don't really know how much the magnetic field actually comes from these cables. Maybe it's nothing. But right now, when you're doing a transect, I always think of doing a transect, say across the Sakonnet. You always think of it doing it visually, so that you're seeing the different invertebrates on the sea floor or fish and invertebrates, but also to have a magnetic scope and measure the magnetic field now, so that when the cable goes in, you can see if it's changed or not. I would assume that would be a pretty easy thing to do.
Thank you. So safe to say, though, you wouldn't use human examples for EMF compared to when you're talking about fish. Safe to say that the fish clearly seem to be more sensitive or sense it differently than a human would?
Yeah, well, I would expect so, since I think they can sense the magnetic field, whereas humans tend to get lost in the woods and have to look for moss on them.
Great, thank you.
So Dave, I think Dave has a question.
Who goes first? Then we'll go back to me.
All right, and then we're going to go to the audience.
Okay, great. I just wanted to bring up the topic of alternative routes. Okay, whenever you do an environmental impact statement, one of the things that you are required to do is evaluate alternatives. And so anyone who's considering running a cable from the offshore wind farms, which are well to the south and east, needs, and if they want to get to Brayton Point, they have a few alternatives. One is to run up the Sakonnet River, another is to land it more close to the wind farm and run across land. And so I just wanted to quote a letter from the National Marine Fisheries Service to BOEM, and it's dated December 1st, 2021. So it's almost a year old. But they were talking about potential impacts to juvenile codfish and some of that. And one of the things that they state is all potential alternative routes to the Brayton Point Power Station connection should be evaluated, including land-based routing alternatives. So I think, you know, they're thinking that the developers should all consider alternatives. So I don't know.
All right, thank you, Rich.
Yeah.
Dave, do you have a question?
Yeah, it's kind of related. So, you know, this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's a cable being laid potentially on the West Passage in Narragansett Bay too. So how do we assess cumulative impacts of this happening both in the Sakonnet River and in the West Passage potentially? It's a big issue offshore. So is there ways to do that? Does DEM have the authority to make the wind farm companies work together, which is lacking offshore, to look at these things as one impact?
I guess briefly on authority, I think that may even be higher up the food chain within state government. But what I will say is we've always encouraged communication, collaboration towards trying to decrease environmental impacts to Narragansett Bay and Rhode Island state waters. It's always been something we've commented and advocated for. To the cumulative effects question, it's a really good point. It's very hard. I don't know of many studies that have been able to effectively do it. I guess one of the things I've often thought about is if there are multiple cables running into a given state, how do we leverage scientific programs and monitoring to answer multiple questions across the different cables? So, you know, if you're using one survey to monitor one portion of the ecosystem in the West Passage, do you do the same one somewhere else, or do you take that opportunity to explore something else that could lend information to what you're not monitoring in the other system? So I've thought about it more in the context of as these with cumulative perhaps cables and in development, how do you answer multiple or as many questions as possible to then guide information or inference on the other system? But I think with the cumulative impacts, the only way to do it would be to have indefinite or long-term monitoring of all these systems and see how they how the system changes in response to not just ongoing environmental change, but then also with increased development.
I'll just add that perhaps you don't know that all the wind farms are actually using the same type of cable too. There might be different shielding, different power capacities. So that'll change as well. Most of the wind farm companies are required to do their environmental assessment for their particular field, but there's a push, and I think some of the companies are trying themselves to coordinate and work together. But there hasn't been a huge amount on that regional scale and the cumulative effect. That I think that's really BOEM's preview, that they have to be the ones to lead in that, and I'm not sure that they are right now.
Can you say the BOEM?
BOEM's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they're the ones that are lease the areas and set the requirements, for example, for the environmental impact for each area.
Okay, thank you. We're all going to stay up here, and then we're going to, Greg and I are going to work on answering any of the questions that you may have for all of our panelists. So does anyone have a question? Yeah, right here.
This is for Greg and for Kevin. Lots of great data on fish populations and over time.
Oh, can you use the mic? Because it's, sorry, I wasn't quite fast enough there.
Lots of great data on fish populations over time and the current condition of the estuary. My own experience over the last 45 years fishing commercially and otherwise, seeing the Sakonnet River be eutrophied, seeing the change in fish populations, the decline in a number of really critical fish populations. All of that data, do you feel that the Sakonnet River and the other local rivers are in decline or under stress of any kind currently now? And if so, how stressed are they?
I don't know if I would say the entire system whole is in decline or in stress, but certainly many of the species that I mentioned today are. You know, when we think about what winter flounder was, for example, and back in the 90s there was lobster up into Mount Hope Bay, for example. So many of the species that have historically been significant to Rhode Island, either economically or culturally, have declined. We've also seen a number of new species in greater abundance there that are either commercially or recreationally sought after, that have supported not just those users, but then also that role in the ecosystem that has been vacated by the species that were there. So I oftentimes think of it as, in some ways, like a revolving door. Of some species have been in decline with changes in the environment or harvest or whatever it might be, with other new species now filling that void or role in the ecosystem. Has the productivity, for example, for the Sakonnet changed entirely or at the highest level cumulatively? I don't know the answer for that. My gut is I don't necessarily think so. I think there's still a lot of species and animals that use the system, both old and new. But yes, there certainly has been significant declines in some of the species that have not only been iconic, but what we oftentimes consider the indicators of a healthy ecosystem.
I just add a good use of that type of data is to try and pick your sentinel species. So sentinel species, like I work with scallops, and so I'm a big advocate of them being a sentinel species for the continental shelf. But basically, they're a canary in a coal mine. So with that kind of data, you pick the species that you think are going to really indicate a change in the system, and you make sure that you follow those species and you use those to target in some of your sampling. So kind of decide, as Conor was saying, have different meetings to decide what are the most important questions you want to look at, but then pick species that you have the data to reflect on that. I mean, sturgeon's a great one, but if you've not caught a sturgeon in 20 or 30 years, you might not want to use that one, for example.
I wanted to thank you. That was really nice to see both of those presentations. And I had a particular interest in, Kevin, your slide where you showed how quickly the U.S. is developing their continental shelf in our waters compared to Europe. And I think it's great that we're getting a lot of data right now sort of as a baseline, but this is kind of related to what Rich was saying, which is if we find out that this is bad, are we going to be finding out too late? So that's one question I have for you. The other is, how much influence do you have on BOEM? Because it seems like what you're mentioning is that the environmental impact statements may not actually be adequate. And do you all have a way of trying to ask BOEM to actually either ask other questions or be a little bit more rigorous about it? And in particular, the timing of the migratory fish seems like it could be influenced by these things, where we're going to be developing, 8% of our continental shelf in the next 10 years, and none of the data out of Europe is actually on a continental shelf, and so we could be really influencing things. And can you make BOEM actually have an analysis that would incorporate some of those questions?
So the first part of your question about the speed, it is on a very fast track here, and you're right that we could make a mistake and not know. I mean, we're putting the Coast Guard said you have to put it on a 1-by-1 nautical mile grid. Is that right? Or if you put it on a 2-by-2, could the fishing industry interact in a better way, or navigation interact a better way? We're investing a lot of it very quickly, so it is, in my opinion, it's full speed ahead. You'd like to see one field develop, study it for 3 or 4 years, or 4 or 5 years, and then say, okay, this would be a better option. We're not, as far as I can tell, we're not doing that. Maybe in the end, because of the economics and that will happen anyway because of the market, just slowing down in the changing world. But the projections is that it's going to happen very quickly. As far as talking to BOEM, I actually...
Can you say, though, it's happening very quickly? Why?
Well, I think why? It's because of the climate change, and it's, with these different states and the federal government have mandates to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. And this is a way that's looked at to solve part of that issue. It's you have to remember that the development that we're having going on now, so we're going to develop by 2030. I think it's, I had it on a slide, but I think it's 30 gigawatts. But by 2050, the plan is 110 gigawatts. And if we were going to be carbon neutral relying on wind farm, you'd have to increase that to 360. So, for example, for Massachusetts, and this is again from Jeff Cole's calculations, if you wanted to replace the power on the grid by offshore wind now, you would need 40 vineyard wind fields built offshore. I mean, it's a lot of wind power and a lot of energy. But there is this very real concern about climate change. There are other ways to also address that energy. There's conservation. There's hydropower. There's nuclear power. But this is one of the directions that, as a country, I guess we've decided to go.
Well, just to respond to that, you mentioned that.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, you mentioned that this huge, massive development is going to give us about 70 million metric tons of savings of carbon dioxide. But 1% change of a plankton population can change that carbon dioxide cost or benefit by several hundred million of metric tons. So if our wind farms change plankton blooms by 1%, we're going to have created a bigger debt than anything that these wind farms can actually save.
Absolutely, and people don't really realize the amount that plankton. I mean, it's like 60% of all carbon, right?
Yeah.
It takes it's a huge amount, and that's true. And that study that I referenced there shows that each one of these pillars, I think it's for every 1 square foot of colonization, you're taking 113 square feet of primary productivity out of the water.
Right.
So there is a counter. And I mean, some of this stuff we can model. I mean, we're not just it's not just guesses. We can start to put these.
But BOEM isn't asking those.
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak for BOEM, but my understanding is they're not asking all those questions. So to answer your second question, I serve on the National Academy of Science, COSA, And COSA is an advisory panel of scientists that does advise BOEM, and so I am at least putting, you know, I'm not just saying it to you guys and then going away. I'm saying it to them too. Now, whether they listen to me or not, I'm not sure whether my students listen to me. So I'm not, but anyway, I am putting it forward.
So I think that's, you know, one of the fundamental issues we're dealing with is what BOEM cares about, what their directive is, and that's to produce offshore energy. It's not to conserve the environment, it's to produce offshore energy within the bounds of the law. So you have another entity in the government, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They're the ones who are supposed to care about fisheries and stuff like that, and they're not in charge of offshore development. So that's why we're kind of seeing this conflict between the best way to develop these from a scientific and preserving the fisheries and the environment versus, you know, build them now and we'll see what we did later type of opinion.
Yeah, and to follow up on what David just said, BOEM will listen to people, but whether or not they actually are directed by anyone is really, you know, it's difficult to say. I mean, scientific panels, they will listen to. States, they will listen to. Some of these letters that I reviewed were from NOAA, you know, National Marine Fisheries Service, and so those other agencies, they're required to listen to them, but the state doesn't have any power to do anything, really, just to comment.
Well, they do with the cable, because the cable is running through the state waters, and BOEM does have task force, just to balance this conversation a little. BOEM does have task force, and there is a task force for Massachusetts and Rhode Island where we do have representatives on there, and you're right, it is advisory, and there is a public process where BOEM, and again, I'm speaking objectively and just to contribute to the conversation, that there are times within the BOEM process where public input is requested. So there are places for that. And on that point, I'm wondering, and I want to start with Greg and go down this way, Kevin, you're last, is we have many decision makers, whether they be taxpayers or elected officials. What if there was one question, right? You would want either these people who are listening to this conversation, if you would want them to ask one question to either the developer or a federal or state regulator, what would that question or comment be? Just one. And do you need a moment?
So I guess my one question would be, could the same benefit from the project be achieved if the cable was run on land? Okay. Would it take away any of the benefits to the environment, to the power grid, if we just ran the cable on land?
Okay. Dave, you're next.
I guess I'll just be repetitive and say I would ask them to think about and talk about this not as a solely, this is the only thing that's happening in the environment, that there's other construction going on potentially, that this needs to be looked at holistically and not as just an individual project in the Sakonnet River.
And when you say holistically, do you mean within Narragansett Bay or broader?
I think that's,
than that?
yeah, so for this type of conversation, I think that's kind of the appropriate scope. But seriously, it needs to be, the continental shelf too, because like Conor and Kevin talked about species that use the bay, use the river, and also come offshore. So if you build something in the river and that's a juvenile habitat for cod, like Conor was showing, is that going to impact the fishery offshore?
Okay, great. Rich, one thing.
Are we sure scientifically that the noise impacts and the sediment disturbance caused by cable installation are not going to cause long-term effects in the fish habitat, fisheries, or shellfish?
Okay.
Maybe a little bit on that note, my question would be, how do they plan to assess environmental impact if they were to lay the cable there? What would their approach be?
Okay. And what is an appropriate approach, in your opinion?
I think, well, I mean, to date, a lot of the techniques that Kevin described that were also within my presentation are tools to understand impacts. I think you could even be perhaps a bit more innovative or, open-minded as to thinking about the species specific to the Sakonnet. How do we assess those? How do we understand whelk impact? How do we understand quahog impact? How do we understand tautog impact? Those would be the types of questions that I would be interested to hear responses to.
And I guess I'll put in a plug for my paper there. That's what yeah. But that whether
who is this to, by the way? First of all, your plug. No, who is this? A developer? Is this the regulator? Or
well, probably the regulator. Although I think that everyone needs to think about having a scientific framework that incorporates not just the ecological, but also the economic, social, and institutional. And whether it's the Sakonnet River or the whole continental shelf, you still should have a framework that considers those four aspects and weighs them out so that you can make a intelligent decision about it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are there other questions people would like to? Yeah, well, let's go here and then we'll go to you. Okay.
Yeah, so my understanding is, the developer or the company or whatever is going to do the environmental impact statement, right? That's part of their responsibility prior to getting too far along in the project to influence, to change things or whatever based on that environmental impact study, right?
Well, just real quickly, officially the EIS is done by BOEM. However, what actually happens is the developer does the work, submits it to BOEM, they review it, and then they publish it.
Okay, but I guess my question would be, what is the state doing? Because what we heard from Conor is more about, here we're monitoring this and we'll monitor the effects after the fact, which, as the lady in front of me was saying, is really too late, right? So what is the state doing or other people doing in terms of also predicting these environmental impacts so that they can intelligently review what BOEM comes up with and or counter what BOEM comes up with, right? Because unless you have that information ahead of time, and there's got to be many other places where cables were run up a river in Europe or wherever else they've developed this wind energy. So what can we learn from what's gone on in other places to say, okay, we think this is an environmental impact that we're concerned about, and make sure that's either covered in the environmental impact study or is commented on or countered against the environmental impact study to say, wait a second, you're saying this is all going to be okay. Well, this is not what we have learned from studying it. Otherwise, you're just getting whatever the company and BOEM want to tell you about the environmental impact.
So I'll start. I guess the first comment, for the surveys we do, they're not guided to understand impacts of the Sakonnet River. They're long-term monitoring to understand changes over time, ultimately used to inform fisheries management decisions via stock assessment model inputs. That's effectively the best available data we have at that scale to even know what's there and through season, by year, or just a long-term snapshot, which is the real need for fine-scale, high spatiotemporal sampling to understand effectively each of the nooks and crannies of the Sakonnet, for example, what the system looks like, irrespective of what would or may happen. What is the current state of the Sakonnet? So there's a little bit of a difference in the tools that we use and what they're for and what the goals ultimately would be for the Sakonnet. Regarding regional literature or worldwide literature on impacts, it is very helpful to see what the possible responses of a system could be to offshore wind based on what happened in Europe or somewhere else. I would also argue, I would caution rather that it's not necessarily what will happen here as well. They're different systems, the oceanography is different, the species are different, the climate's different. So I often caution folks, it's not apples to apples, and so it's useful but not gospel in terms of trying to being able to anticipate what's going to happen. You know, as was discussed earlier, different shelf structure, different estuaries, and ultimately different species that live here, which I think is, you know, part of the importance for today, and with folks to discuss, again, from a science perspective, from a recreation perspective, commercial perspective, or just general public, what are the elements ecologically that are important to the system that we were trying to maintain and preserve, and how do we go best about doing so?
Yeah, no, I understand that, but unless you influence the project before it occurs, you're going to get what you get.
So I guess in response to that, as part of DEM, we respond to every environmental impact statement that BOEM puts out that impacts Rhode Island. So in that context, we're providing all the literature that we have found on potential impacts to larvae, to adults, migration, pile driving, both offshore environments, the cable route. So we're also trying to provide that, as well as the fine scale stuff that may not be on BOEM's radar, like what's going on with the research for Atlantic cod, for stock structure, and how there's ongoing efforts to better understand the spatial scales of these species that will only magnify a problem if it were to occur from an adverse impact on a stock. So we are providing as much as we can, particularly as it relates to species important to Rhode Island, either from a stakeholder perspective or from the ecosystem. And it's, to Kevin's point, you know, we're providing feedback to them on perhaps science that they missed in their assessment that could influence how they change their perspective on a perceived impact, as well as literature or science that from a national perspective or national agency they may not know specific to this system, but as the state of Rhode Island scientists that we are intimate with.
And DEM is on the task force, is that correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, I can let him talk.
If you have do you have something?
Yeah, so it's not for the environmental impact statement, but for when the monitoring actually occurs, a way to ensure that you don't just get what you get and what the wind farm company tells you is to advocate for people that care about where it's being built to do the research. So from our end, offshore, I run an organization that is led by commercial fishermen. So we engaged offshore developers to try and use commercial fishermen to do the monitoring, to have us be involved. So we have a data sharing agreement with that wind farm company. So we have the ability, if needed, to do any kind of checks on our own with the conclusions that they're coming up with. And we know the people out there fish out there and care about that environment, not some hired gun to just produce the result that you want. So for the Sakonnet River, it would be, you know, when you come to meetings like this, support and push for Mayflower to use organizations like the Saltwater Anglers or others that actually utilize and care about the river to do their impact assessment.
Great, thank you. Yes, you have a question?
Thank you. My family's been on the Sakonnet since 1964, and two things have stood out of changes in that time. One, not surprisingly, is the sea level, which is, and one question would be if any of your organizations have specific data on how much the Sakonnet has risen over 50 years, pick a number, whatever. So that would be the first one. I mean, there used to be a beach at high tide, and now the water's up the seawall. The second issue would be whether it's the salinity or the temperature or whatever of the Sakonnet. It used to be that the rocks were relatively clean, covered with barnacles or whatever. Now for the past 15 or 20 years, there's like a green moss that covers much of the rocks, and this is probably the northern 10% of the Sakonnet on the Portsmouth side. So I don't know if that is something, if you have information on the temperature of the Sakonnet and how that has changed over time, but just interested if you have any data on those two items.
So admittedly, our organization, or Marine Fisheries, does not have information on sea level rise. The department does, and USGS and other organizations do monitor sea level rise at various points throughout the state. But I don't know of any specific monitoring to the Sakonnet. And the question, of course, being, is sea level rise in one area of Rhode Island applicable to another? And I don't.
So Pam, could someone give Pam Rubinoff the mic? Pam, did you hear the question? So Pam is our secret weapon here tonight. Pam, can you tell us who you are and why you're here?
Pam Rubinoff from URI's Coastal Resources Center in Rhode Island Sea Grant, and I do work actually with this community on coastal resilience and sea level rise. And so the easiest place that I would probably go, and I can check after this, is to NOAA's tide gauges. So for each of the NOAA tide gauges, there is a history of sea level trends. And so for Newport, you could see the trends since 1938 that show that we've had around 10 or 11 inches of sea level rise. And for here in Rhode Island, we do have estimates of what that will look like in the future. So we have maps that show what that would look like in the future. So we could share that information with you. And I'm not quite sure which tide gauge would be the best for which area in the Sakonnet, but they're easy to find.
And Pam does a good job with my coast as well, right? Katie Bland, do you have anything to, so we have another secret weapon here. Katie Bland, who's with New Hampshire Sea Grant and also with a program called Narragansett, right? Do you want to say, you weren't planning on saying anything, but go ahead.
I wasn't planning on saying anything. We also have tide gauges that...
Come on up.
So I'm a Sea Grant colleague from New Hampshire here to observe. Didn't realize I was going to be speaking. And I also work for Narragansett, the Northeastern Regional Association of Coastal Ocean Observing Systems. And we have a suite of different monitoring systems, buoys, gliders, tide gauges, nutrient monitors. So I can give you our website. We have some good visualizations on water level, and unfortunately I don't think it goes back to 1968, but it'd be helpful at least for the lifetime of those water level monitors.
Great. I guess that was a little commercial about sea level rise. Yes, you have a question over here.
Yeah, I have a question. Just based on the information you have today on the biomass and all that, is there a recommended direction that you would suggest that this has the minimal impact? If we took all the information we knew about sensitive areas and all these other things that we currently have, could you project an optimal route, whether it be through the sea, through the river, over the land, so that you at least have an opinion that says this is probably the best way we know of, and then when someone comes back with the route, because they're saying we want to go up the Sakonnet, what else should you really look at? And can you guide them to a direction in that way? So I just don't know if you can aggregate the data that you have to say, look, these are our sensitive areas, these are not sensitive, can we manage a way through that? So.
Yeah, so I think some of the data is useful towards that. Some of the more spatial data from our random sampling over time, like the lobster ventless survey or others. Some of them, the fixed sites, because they only look at one spot, it doesn't provide you any spatial resolution other than that site in terms of where one would go. I think from maybe a holistic perspective, of course, the least impact to the marine environment would be the least distance you have to travel through the ocean to get up there. I guess that would be like my first thought on that. But in terms of the guidance, I would think about the species of significance over there and how those interact with the system and what they're like what Kevin was speaking earlier. What are their life history strategies that may pose a problem to a prospective cable? So one of the ones I think about a lot again is whelk, in terms of how much do they move? Do they require very specific areas to lay their egg casings? And if they don't move a lot and they require a certain spot, and that happens to be a cable route, then like what does that mean for their local population within the Sakonnet River? So I think about it more so like what are the species that are there, and how are their life cycles vulnerable or not to prospective impact in the sediment or in the benthic environment.
Does that answer your question?
It does. It just says we've got more work to do.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. We have a question, Anna Faith, right behind.
Hi. I've been fishing for a lot of years too. Been here for 40 years in this area. And basically I'm very nervous, to tell you the truth, about this whole thing happening. I'm wondering who's policing it, who's watching, what's going to happen to our environment, and how much impact do you really have to these companies and say, okay, no, that's not going to work. It's going to cause too much of an impact on the whelk or the togs or whatever, fisheries. And who has the last say? You know, I'm nervous about it, to be honest.
I guess for the say in terms of guiding, I think a lot of the things we do provide in our comment letters to BOEM and Mayflower is here's the data we have on what we have for species here and what that looks like spatially where possible. Some of the data I was mentioning to the gentleman earlier. And so that's you, and again, as Jen spoke to earlier, we're providing comments as advisory, but with the hope that from the state agency that BOEM will take them seriously, or the developer, and work every way possible to mitigate those concerns. So we're providing all that information similar to what I provided tonight to help guide them and say these are areas of high lobster catch, or these are high, we do see tautog or recreational angling here that's significant. So we're providing that, as well as, you know, stakeholders that we recommend or try and get in touch with the developer and such to make sure these considerations are had. In terms of the last say, a lot of it, perhaps someone, you know, higher in the government system, but a lot of what we're doing is trying to guide any type of decision making in terms of trying to mitigate any impacts, not just to the marine environment, but to the users that rely on that system.
But how much power do you have to actually make it stop if you think it's really going to hurt our environment? That's what I'm afraid of. Do we have enough power to stop this?
Well, the second part is I think it's unknown. That's part of the challenge, how each species will respond. Like, I don't know if whelk will cross the cable route and act as if it doesn't exist. Right. Which makes it very hard in terms of providing guidance on a preferred route or an assessment. So we do look to the literature to try to understand how these species will respond, and particularly ones that are important to the system. But in terms of quantifying an impact, it's particularly challenging given those uncertainties.
Yeah, on that topic, I just wanted to add, this type of a forum is very useful early on in the process, and this is actually very early on in the process. Typically, we don't have a public hearing or anything like this until there's actually a draft EIS on the street. You know, and this type of a forum can help influence what goes into that draft EIS. So it's very good if people have comment and feedback that can go into the system. Now, ultimately, I think the answer to your question about who has the authority to oversee it, it's really CRMC. So the Coastal Resource Management Council, Rhode Island, has the authority, because what's going to happen is all of the conditions that we are talking about now and that go into the draft environmental impact statement, those will become a condition of the permit that CRMC grants to the developer. Okay, so if these things aren't considered prior to the permit being granted, then the developer will have permission to do it the way he put in the permit. Okay, so it's important to get all this stuff up front early and get it into the permit, and that way CRMC will have the authority to say you're not doing it in accordance with the permit, therefore you must stop.
Yeah, but there's also a political process here. You know, it's and you know, and this is why we're doing these educational evenings, because you know, the process is only as good as what we put in it. And if you're more informed and you know what questions to ask, then the process will be more effective. And we do have, which is amazing, great decision makers here who are listening to this, and also I'm sure expressing and thinking about questions that they would also like to ask about the process. So I think we have, we have a question for one more question. The gentleman in the back.
Yeah, Kevin, well, thank you for the opportunity and the education. I was also struck. I'm like the lady in the back. I'm actually pretty worried hearing about this. I mean, and learning about it, and I was struck by, Kevin, that slide on the growth and the magnitude of what's going on. And so I was actually interested in practically, from the political point of view, from the citizens of Rhode Island and the various committees, what can people do? Because the little I know, there are multiple cables coming up. 1 mile on 1 mile, the project that at least I'm a little bit more familiar with, Revolution Wind, that could include over 100 turbines, 873 feet, which would be the tallest structures ever put on the planet in the ocean, in a critical area. And as was pointed out, the North Sea, where I've been, that's a lot different than what's out here on the continental shelf. And I think I saw one slide where it would take 7 years to even decommission. And I'm not sure there's even the money to decommission them. Once they're in, if you look around the country, I think there are 18,000 windmills that are not even turning, that are sitting rusting across the country. What practically can people do at this point? And how do you suggest they organize? So that was a long-winded statement with a question, I guess.
I might be able to partly answer that one. Everybody from your local town legislatures to your state government on up, you can speak up, and if enough people do, I mean, the country as a whole right now is committed to renewable energy and to wind power, and that's not going to change easily or quickly, but that doesn't mean it can't change. I mean, nothing is static. The commitment that we've made over the past years to other energy sources has come and gone, but it's going to take a fair amount of citizens to change that our commitment. I mean, we saw that where they're looking to go an 80% increase just in a few years compared to Europe, which is moving a lot slower. That's clearly where the government, where our country as a whole is going right now. So to change that, it's not going to be easy, and it might not even to say that's the right or the wrong thing, but the only way to change it is to start somewhere, and to let folks know that either you're concerned about the speed of the development, or whatever your personal opinion is fine, but it's just going to take a lot of voices if we're going to change that part of this. Hopefully, locally, we can have an effect perhaps on a cable route, things like that. I mean, that's certainly what we're hopeful here today, to try to find more about what we might want to say and how we might want to suggest or word things. But from a national standpoint, right, it's going to take a lot of folks speaking up if we're going to change the national viewpoint on this.
Yeah, and again, I know we also, there are issues related to climate change, and that we do need to consider that bigger picture as we move forward. So with that, I want to thank the panelists. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, the Common Fence Point Community Center. This is a beautiful place. Thank you very much for letting us have this event here. We really appreciate it. And again, if there's a specific question, if you'd like to further know more about something, whether it be a visual aspect to it, or what is climate change and how does it affect offshore wind energy, how does energy get to your house, please put it on here, and we'd be happy to consider that as the next topic as we move forward. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you soon. Thanks.